Joseph didn't know it yet. None of them did. But the moment he raised his hand and pointed Mary toward the door, he wasn't purifying his bloodline. He was ending it. That is the cruelest thing about pride. It always costs you the most at the exact moment you are most convinced it is saving you. The Iron Ridge throne room had been built to intimidate. That was its only true purpose. Not justice, not governance, not the protection of the weak. It had been built so that anyone who stood inside it would feel small. The stone was dark and cold. The ceilings were impossibly high. The torches burned in iron brackets along the walls, not for warmth, but for visibility, so that witnesses could see every face clearly, so that no one could later claim they did not watch. Mary stood at the center of the room, the way a woman stands when she has already made peace with the outcome. Her hands were still damp from the laundry. There was lye under her fingernails. She had been pulled from the washing basin before she could rinse them, and she had thought, walking through these corridors for what she understood would be the last time, that there was something almost perfectly honest about that she should leave the same way she had spent every day here, mid-task, still working, still useful, still invisible. She was not afraid of Alpha King Joseph Herman. She was afraid for Paul. That was the difference between them that neither of them fully understood yet. Joseph was afraid of what people thought of him. Mary was afraid of what would happen to a child who had no one else. One of those fears was about image. The other was about love. And history has a long memory for which one it rewards. Joseph stood on the raised dais, his council flanking him in their ceremonial black. His face held the particular expression of a man who has rehearsed his cruelty enough times to mistake it for conviction. He called her what the pack had always called her: wolfless, worthless, a stain on a royal house that deserved better. The pack called her weak because she fainted sometimes. They did not know why. They did not ask. It is far easier to mock what you do not understand than to sit with the discomfort of your own ignorance. Mary let his words move through her like the weather. She had learned years ago not to store them anywhere permanently. She looked past him, just once, toward the far corridor, toward the wing where a boy, Joseph's son Paul, the heir to everything in this room, was at this moment sitting in his lessons, healthy and bright-eyed, and completely unaware that the only reason his heart was still beating was standing barefoot on cold stone, being told she was nothing. She had been keeping him alive for 5 years. She would not tell Joseph that. Not here. Not like this. She simply listened until he finished. And when Alpha King Joseph Herman pointed toward the door with the full weight of his authority and told her she had until the first howl of night to disappear into the Grey Barrens, Mary did something he did not expect. She nodded, not because she agreed, but because she understood something about power that Joseph Herman had never learned and was about to learn the hardest possible way. That the most dangerous person in any room is never the loudest one. It is always the one who knows something no one else does and is quietly watching the clock. She turned. She walked out. And somewhere behind the heavy velvet curtains of the lesson hall, a 5-year-old boy who would never know what she had given up for him watched the rain begin to fall and felt, for the very first time in his short life, a cold he did not have a name for, yet settle into his chest. The tether had broken. The clock had started. The pack elders sat in their high-backed chairs the way men sit when they have already decided the verdict and are only present for the performance of it. 7 of them. 7 men who had watched Mary scrub their floors, mend their garments, and disappear into the background of Iron Ridge's grandeur for years without once learning her last name. They looked at her now with the focused attention of people who only notice a thing when they are about to destroy it. Joseph spoke for 12 minutes. Mary counted. He cited pack law, ancient doctrine, the sacred purity of the Herman bloodline. He used words like liability and contamination and mercy. That last one the most dishonest of all. Now, because what he was describing as mercy was the act of letting her leave with her life rather than without it. He said it with genuine conviction, and that was perhaps the most chilling part. He was not lying in the room. He was lying to himself, and he had done it so thoroughly and for so long that the lie had become his truth. That is what unchecked pride does to a person. It doesn't just corrupt your actions. It corrupts your ability to see your actions clearly. Joseph Herman was not a stupid man. He was a certain one. And certainty, when it is built on the wrong foundation, is far more dangerous than ignorance. The elders nodded at the appropriate moments. One of them, the oldest, a man named Crest, who had known Mary since she arrived as a girl of 12, kept his eyes on the stone floor. She noticed. She filed it away not as comfort, but as information. Even the ones who know better will stay silent when silence is the safer choice. That is not a judgment. It is simply the oldest truth about institutions that have never been challenged. Joseph finished. The room waited. Mary said nothing. She had learned that silence, in rooms like this one, was the only answer they could not control. You cannot argue with silence. You cannot humiliate it. You cannot make it look small. She gave them nothing to hold and watched the discomfort move through the room like a current. Joseph raised his hand, pointed toward the door. His voice dropped to the register men use when they want to sound like history, rather than a person making a choice they may not be able to undo. You have until the first howl. Do not make me send wolves after you. She turned and walked, and Joseph Herman, Alpha King of Iron Ridge, the most powerful man in 3 territories, felt it the moment she crossed the threshold. A cold so sudden and so sourceless that it moved through his chest like a hand closing around something vital. He straightened. He said nothing. He told himself it was the draft from the open corridor. He was still telling himself that 2 hours later, when his son stopped breathing, they escorted her. 2 pack warriors, broad-shouldered and silent, who walked close enough to ensure she kept moving, but far enough to avoid any association with her. She understood the choreography of it. They were not walking her to the border. They were walking her shame to the border. She was simply attached to it. The pack watched from doorways and windows, some openly, some from behind the partial shelter of curtains pulled almost shut. Children stared with the uncomplicated honesty that adults had trained themselves out of. An older woman, someone whose fever Mary had broken 2 winters ago with a poultice she'd sat up through the night to prepare, turned away before their eyes could meet. Mary did not blame her. She simply noted it the way you note weather. The way you learn, after enough years, to stop expecting warmth from a sky that has only ever given you cold. There is a particular kind of loneliness in being useful to people who do not respect you. It is different from ordinary loneliness. It is loneliness with an invoice attached. You are present, you are needed, you are called upon, but you are never truly seen. Many people spend entire lifetimes in that condition, mistaking being needed for being valued. They are not the same thing. They have never been the same thing. The border of Iron Ridge territory was marked by a line of iron posts driven into the earth, each one etched with the pack's crest. Beyond them, the Grey Barrens began, a stretch of dead land and dense, lightless forest that the pack used as both a boundary and a warning. Things lived in the Barrens, things that had been exiled or had never been anything else. Joseph had not said the words, but she understood what sending her here meant. It was not banishment. It was a sentence with extra steps. She stopped at the last post. The warriors did not follow her past it. That was the border of their responsibility, or perhaps the border of their conscience. She did not turn to look at them. She turned to look at the palace. It rose behind the settlement in the gray morning light, stone and iron, and the accumulated weight of a bloodline that had ruled these lands for generations. Somewhere inside it, on the third floor, in a room with blue curtains because blue had been his mother's favorite color, Paul Herman was in his lessons. She felt it go. Not dramatically, not with pain, just a thread she had been holding for 5 years, taut and constant as a heartbeat, going slack in her hands, like a rope cut at the other end, like a candle put out by someone in another room. She pressed her palm flat against the iron post, steadied herself. Hold on, Paul, she thought. Not a prayer, exactly. Something older than prayer. The specific plea of someone who has given everything they have and is now watching the clock on what they couldn't give enough of. Then she turned and walked into the gray. 5 years ago, the palace did not sleep. It had been 3 days since the Luna's labor began, and the healers had stopped pretending they were winning. Mary knew it the way servants always know things before they are told. Through the quality of silence in the corridors, through the way the senior staff moved with the particular efficiency of people managing a disaster rather than supporting a birth. Through the sound, late on the second night, of Alpha King Joseph Herman's voice breaking in a room 2 floors above the laundry, and the silence that followed it that was somehow worse than the sound. Luna Sarah died at dawn on the 3rd day. The baby lived, barely. Mary was 17 years old. She had no business being in the royal nursery. She had been sent to deliver fresh linens and had arrived to find the room's only healer collapsed from exhaustion in the corridor, the wet nurse still 2 hours away, and a newborn boy lying in a carved wooden crib, his skin the color of ash, his breathing so shallow it barely moved his chest at all. She set down the linens. She crossed to the crib. She looked at him. He was the smallest thing she had ever seen. And spreading from the center of his tiny chest, threading outward along his ribs like roots looking for water, were veins the color of midnight, thin as hair, dark as a consequence. She did not know what she was doing when she reached for him. She would not have been able to explain it then, and would struggle to explain it in the years that followed. It was not a decision exactly. It was closer to a recognition. Her hands knew something her mind had no language for yet. She pressed 2 fingers gently to his sternum, just above the darkest point, and she felt it. The curse, cold and ancient and patient, pressing against the inside of his skin like something that had been waiting a very long time to finish what it started. She pulled. It moved into her like ice water through a crack. She gasped. Her knees buckled. She caught the edge of the crib with her free hand and held on and kept pulling until the black in his veins had faded to gray and then to nothing, and the baby's color shifted from ash to something closer to living, and his breathing deepened into something that sounded, for the first time, like it intended to continue. There are people in this world who are born with the capacity to carry what others cannot. Not because they are stronger, but because something in them, some deep, unasked for grace, refuses to let an innocent thing suffer when they have the power to prevent it. The world does not always reward that quality, but it always needs it. Mary straightened. She looked at the boy. Paul, she would learn his name was Paul, sleeping now with both fists curled against his chest, the way infants sleep when they have finally decided to trust the world enough to rest. She picked up her linens. She walked out. She told no one. And she came back the next night, and the night after that, and every night for 5 years. By the time Paul was 2 years old and running through the palace corridors on unsteady legs, laughing at nothing in particular the way healthy children do, Mary had fainted 4 times, once in the laundry, once on the stairs, once in the middle of the great hall during a pack gathering, which was the one that cost her the most. Not physically, but in the way people looked at her afterward, with the particular mixture of contempt and satisfaction that some people reserve for those they have decided are beneath them and who have just provided evidence. They called her sickly. They said it the way people say things they want to be true because it is convenient, not with malice exactly, but with the ease of a conclusion that requires no further thought. She was wolfless, and now she was weakly, and that was simply what she was. A girl with nothing to offer, who could not even manage the basic dignity of staying on her feet. She let them say it. She had learned by then that correcting people who have decided what you are is an exhausting exercise that changes nothing. They do not want information. They want confirmation. And she had other things to do with her energy. This is one of the quietest forms of injustice, when the evidence of your sacrifice is used as proof of your inadequacy. When the cost of what you are carrying is held up as the reason you should be carrying less. Mary was not weak. She was depleted. Those 2 things are not the same, but they look identical to someone who has never had to carry anything for anyone. Paul grew. That was the thing that made it bearable and the thing that made it hardest simultaneously. She would watch him from across the room, bright-eyed, strong, full of the specific confidence of a child who has never had a reason to doubt that the world intends good things for him. And she would feel the ache of the previous night's work move through her bones, and something in her chest would settle into a quiet and uncomplicated peace. He was worth it. That was not a question she debated. It was simply the ground she stood on. She kept her journals hidden in a loose stone beneath the washing basin. Drawings of the black veins as they appeared each night. Notes on how the curse moved, where it concentrated, how much she needed to pull before his breathing steadied. She tracked it the way a doctor tracks a patient, methodically, without drama, because drama was a luxury and she had work to do. Joseph passed her in the corridor sometimes. He never looked at her directly. She was furniture to him, functional and unremarkable and requiring no acknowledgement. She did not resent it. She understood it. A man like Joseph Herman had no framework for what she was because he had never imagined that something as powerful as what she carried could exist inside something as easy to dismiss as her. That was always going to be his most expensive blind spot. He just didn't know the bill was coming. The lesson had been going well. Sauve Paul was working through his cartography maps, tracing the territory boundaries with a small finger, naming each landmark the way his tutor had taught him, his voice carrying the focused confidence of a boy who enjoys knowing things. The tutor, an older man named Aldrich, who had taught 3 generations of Herman heirs and prided himself on having seen everything, was watching him with quiet satisfaction. Then, Paul stopped. He looked at his right hand, the way a person looks at something that belongs to them, but has suddenly become unfamiliar. His fingers had stilled over the map. The skin along his knuckles had gone the color of a bruise. Not purple, not blue, but black. Deep and definitive and spreading, a thin, dark thread moving from the base of his smallest finger toward his wrist, with the slow, purposeful patience of something that had been waiting for exactly this moment. Paul said, quietly and without panic, because he was his father's son and had been raised to name things before he feared them. Aldrich, my hand looks wrong. The tutor crossed the room in 3 steps. He looked, and the confidence of a man who had seen everything left his face entirely. The pack of doctors arrived within minutes. 4 of them, then 6, filling the small lesson room with the particular controlled urgency of professionals encountering something outside their competence, but not yet willing to admit it. They pressed fingers to Paul's pulse. They consulted in low voices. They ran every diagnostic in their training, checking for wolf sickness, for common curses, for allergic reactions to herbs or metals. They found nothing that matched anything they knew, because this was not a wolf sickness. It had no wolf in it at all. There is a specific kind of helplessness that belongs to experts. The moment when all of their knowledge arranges itself neatly in front of them, and none of it is the right tool. It is humbling in a way that ordinary ignorance is not, because ordinary ignorance does not know what it is missing. Expertise knows exactly what it cannot do. And in that gap, fear moves in. By the second hour, the black had reached Paul's wrist. He was not in pain yet. That was almost worse somehow, that his face remained calm, while his body told a different story. He asked twice if his father had been told. He asked once if it was serious. He did not ask a 3rd time because he was old enough to read the answer in the room. Joseph arrived to find his son sitting upright in his chair, one arm lying flat on the table, dark veins spreading toward his elbow like ink dropped in water. The pack's finest medical minds standing around him in helpless silence. The cold Joseph had felt when Mary crossed the threshold 2 hours ago returned now. Not in his chest this time, but in his stomach, low and certain, and telling him something his pride was not yet ready to hear. He looked at his son's arm. He looked at his doctors. "Fix it," he said. None of them answered, and the silence that followed was the first crack. The Barrens announced itself not through sight, but through sound, or rather, through the absence of it. The birds stopped first, then the wind, then everything else, until the only thing left was the sound of Mary's boots on wet ground and the knowledge, arriving with quiet certainty in the back of her mind, that she was no longer the only thing moving in these trees. She had known they would come. Joseph had said, "Do not make me send wolves after you," with the tone of a man who had already sent them and was simply narrating the fact politely. She had been tracking the sounds of them for 20 minutes. The deliberate non-sounds, the too careful silences that predators make when they believe they are invisible. She counted 4, possibly 5. Feral rogues, exiled from packs or born outside them, live in the Barrens the way things live in places no one comes to, by choice. She did not run. Running was an answer to fear, and fear was something she could not afford right now. She kept moving, steady and measured, her eyes reading the tree line the way she had learned to read everything, looking not at the obvious, but at what the obvious was trying to hide. The first one came from the left. Fast and low, the way experienced predators move, spending as little time in the open as possible. She turned into it rather than away from it, which surprised him enough to cost him a second. And a second was all she needed. She pressed her hand to his chest. She had never used the siphon as a weapon. She had only ever used it as a vessel, drawing poison out, absorbing darkness, making herself the container so something innocent didn't have to be. She did not know if it would work differently on something that was already dark all the way through. It did work differently. It worked faster. She pulled, the way she pulled with Paul, but with everything open rather than everything controlled. And what came back into her was not the cold thread of a hereditary curse, but a wall of raw, feral energy, chaotic and enormous, and nothing like Paul's darkness, which had always been sleeping. This was awake. This was angry. It hit her system like a lightning strike, and she cried out, and the rogue went down, not dead, but emptied, stunned, lying on the forest floor with the dazed stillness of something that has had something essential removed without warning. The others stopped. There is a moment in every confrontation when the balance shifts, not through violence exactly, but through revelation. When the thing being hunted reveals itself to be something the hunters were not prepared for, it does not always require strength. Sometimes it only requires that you show them, clearly and without apology, what you actually are. She straightened. She looked at the tree line where the remaining rogues had stilled in the shadows. Her hands were shaking. Her vision was edged with white. She was running on the last of herself, and she knew it. She stood anyway. "Come on then," she said quietly. Not a challenge. A statement. The voice of a woman who has already survived more than this and is simply prepared to survive more still. The shadows did not move. She walked forward, and the Barrens, for the first time, moved out of her way. Joseph went to the laundry room because he had run out of places to go. He had exhausted his doctors. He had summoned specialists from 2 neighboring territories who arrived quickly and left uselessly, their medical knowledge dissolving against the black in Paul's veins, the way water dissolves against stone. He had called his counsel, who offered theories with the confidence of men who understood nothing, and the authority of men who were accustomed to that gap going unnoticed. He had stood at his son's bedside for 3 hours, watching the darkness climb Paul's arm toward his shoulder, with the patience of something that had all the time in the world and knew it. Then he had walked. Through corridors he normally moved with purpose, now moving with none. Past rooms that had no answers. Down to the lowest floor where the palace kept its functional spaces, the kitchens, the storage rooms, the laundry. He did not know why he stopped at her door. It was barely a room. A cot, a small table, a washing basin, shelves of folded linens organized with a precision that seemed excessive for someone the pack had considered beneath organizing anything. He stood in the doorway for a moment and then stepped inside with the uncertain quality of a man entering a space that he suspects will require something of him. He found the loose stone by accident. His boot caught the edge of it, and it shifted, and he looked down, and there was the hollow beneath it, and inside the hollow, the journals, 7 of them. Small, dense, filled front to back with a handwriting that was careful and unhurried. The writing of someone who understood that what they were recording mattered and wanted the record to be accurate. He opened the first one. The drawing stopped him before the words did. Page after page of the black veins, sketched in precise detail, dated, annotated. The progression of the curse, mapped over 5 years with the methodical patience of someone who had been studying it from the inside. He recognized the pattern immediately because he had spent 3 hours staring at its current version spreading across his son's arm. Then he read the words. Tonight, it was deeper than before. I pulled for longer. My hands didn't stop shaking until morning. Paul laughed at breakfast. He is well, that is enough. He turned pages. The entries were not dramatic. That was what undid him. Not the content alone, but the tone of it. Matter of fact, unglamorous. The record of someone doing an enormous thing and treating it as simply the next task on an endless list. The curse is learning. It pushes back harder now. I think it knows I'm the obstacle. I think it's been trying to go around me for months. I won't let it. Joseph sat down on the edge of her cot. He sat there for a long time. There is no humiliation quite like discovering that the person you dismissed as nothing was, in fact, the only thing standing between you and everything you stood to lose. Not because it wounds your pride, though it does, but because you realize your pride was the reason you couldn't see it, that you looked at devotion and called it weakness, that you looked at sacrifice and called it inadequacy, and that somewhere a woman is in a wasteland right now because you were too certain to look down. Joseph closed the journal. He pressed both hands flat against its cover. Outside, down the corridor, now his son was dying. He stood up. He moved with purpose now. The cold, focused urgency of a man who has just understood exactly how badly he has miscalculated and has chosen, rather than collapsing under it, to run. He tracked her for 6 hours. The Barrens gave nothing easily, not direction, not distance, not any of the environmental signals that a trained tracker relies on. The ground was hard and wet simultaneously, the kind of terrain that swallows footprints before they finish forming. He had brought 2 warriors with him and sent them back after the first hour, not because he didn't need them, but because something in him understood that what was about to happen was not something he could afford witnesses for. Some reckonings are private. Some debts can only be paid alone. He found her cave by the cold light of the early evening, a shallow hollow in a rock face, barely deep enough to call shelter, the kind of place you retreat to, not because it is safe, but because it is the last option standing. He heard her breathing before he saw her, uneven, careful. The breathing of someone managing pain with the same quiet discipline they applied to everything else. She was sitting with her back against the stone wall, her knees drawn up, one hand pressed to her side where the rogue's attack had caught her. Her eyes were open. She saw him the moment he ducked through the entrance, and her expression did not change with surprise or fear or any of the emotions he might have expected. She simply looked at him with the level, clear gaze of someone who had already considered this possibility and made their peace with however it resolved. He opened his mouth. The speech he had constructed over 6 hours of tracking, measured, authoritative, framed in the language of necessity and pack law, left him entirely. What came out instead was his son's name, Paul. Just that, just the word, stripped of everything except what it actually was. A father's fear arriving finally without its armor. Mary watched him. Joseph crossed the cave in 2 steps and went to his knees on the stone floor in front of her. Not strategically, not as a calculated gesture of humility designed to produce a result. His legs simply gave way under the weight of what the last 6 hours had cost him, and the ground came up to meet him, and he stayed there because there was nowhere else honest left to go. "He's dying," Joseph said. His voice was not the voice of the throne room. It was not the voice of certainty or authority or the practiced command that moved wolves to obedience. It was just a man's voice, undefended, terrified. "I didn't know. I didn't understand what you were doing. I didn't." He stopped, started again. "I need you to come back. Please." This is what pride costs, not in the abstract, not in theory, but here, on cold stone, in a cave, in a wasteland, begging a woman you discarded to undo what your certainty broke. No version of this moment belongs entirely to him. He built it, brick by brick, with every dismissal, every blind assumption, every time he looked at her sacrifice and decided it was simply the furniture of his life. Mary looked at the most powerful man in 3 territories, kneeling on the ground in front of her. Soaking wet, eyes red, his hands open on his thighs the way a person holds their hands when they have put down every weapon they own. She said nothing for a long moment. She let the silence hold what words would only diminish. Then she pressed her hand against the cave wall and began, slowly and without his help, to stand. They rode back through the night without speaking. Joseph had offered her his horse, and she had declined, and not out of pride, but because she needed to feel the ground under her feet for this last part, needed the walk to be real, earned, hers. He rode slowly beside her without complaint. That, more than the kneeling, more than the pleading, was the thing she noted. That he adjusted his pace to hers without being asked. Small things are often the truest measurements of a changed man. Paul was unconscious when they arrived. The black veins had reached his collarbone. She did not look at the doctors standing helplessly around the bed, or at the council members lining the walls, or at the pack elders who had sat in their high-backed chairs that morning and watched her be discarded. She crossed to the boy, sat on the edge of his bed, and placed both hands on his chest, the way she had done for 5 years in the dark when no one was watching. She pulled. It was harder than it had ever been. 5 years of nightly work had always been a controlled draw, a careful, measured extraction that she could manage and recover from. This was 5 years of accumulated darkness that had been released all at once and had spent 12 hours spreading without resistance. It came back into her in a wave that arched her spine and closed her throat and filled her vision with white and silver and a roaring silence that was the loudest thing she had ever heard. She did not let go. She held on until Paul's color returned, until his breathing deepened and steadied and found its rhythm, until his fingers uncurled from the fists they had made against the sheets, relaxing into the open, trusting looseness of a child who has decided once again to rest. Then she took her hands back and sat very still. The room was completely silent. Joseph stood at the foot of the bed. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who has been comprehensively and irrevocably educated, not by argument, not by explanation, but by consequence. The most permanent kind of learning. The kind that does not require repetition. It was Elder Crest who spoke first. The old man who had kept his eyes on the stone floor that morning, who had known better and said nothing. He spoke now with the careful weight of someone settling a debt they had been carrying all day. We need to discuss her place in this pack. Joseph did not look away from Mary. Her place, he said quietly, is whatever she decides it is. This is the only ending that justice allows. Not revenge, not punishment, but elevation. The woman they tried to erase became the name the pack would speak with reverence for generations, not because she demanded it, but because she earned it in the dark, alone, when no one was watching, when there was no reward and no recognition, and no guarantee that anyone would ever know. That is always how the most important work gets done. The council rewrote the laws of Iron Ridge over the following weeks. Mary did not attend the sessions. She did not need to. She was present in every clause, every protection, every provision written for the wolfless, the outcast, the overlooked. The pack felt her in their new architecture the way a body feels the bones that hold it upright. Without thinking about it, without gratitude exactly, but with the deep cellular knowledge that without this structure, everything falls. She was not the maid anymore. She was the guardian. Her name was spoken first now in every formal address, before the Alpha, before the council, before the elders who had once looked through her like glass. Joseph lived with it. That was his sentence, not exile, not punishment, but clarity. Every morning, he woke in full knowledge of what his certainty had almost cost him. And every morning, he had to choose again to be the man that knowledge required. Some days, it was harder than others. Mary did not make it easier for him. She did not think that was her job. Paul recovered fully. He was 6 years old and remembered none of it except one detail he mentioned to his tutor weeks later. That when everything had been very dark and very cold, he had felt 2 warm hands pressing against his chest, like a door being held shut against a storm. He did not know whose hands they were. Not yet. When he was old enough to understand, Mary told him herself. Simply and without drama. The way she did everything, sitting in the garden in the early morning while the pack went about its life around them. He listened to all of it. Then he sat quietly for a moment, the way children sit when they are holding something larger than they expected. "Every night?" he said. "Every night," she said. He looked at her for a long time with his father's serious eyes. Then he reached over and took her hand with both of his. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. Some things are too large for words and too true for anything except the simple, steady weight of one person's hand in another's. The sun came up over Iron Ridge, warm and unhurried and indifferent to the pride of kings. Mary let it fall on her face, and for the first time in 5 years, she did not have anything left to carry. That feeling, setting down a weight you have carried so long you forgot it was not part of you, is one of the quietest and most profound forms of freedom a person can experience. Not all victories announce themselves. Some of them just feel like rest. Mary carried something for 5 years that no one saw, and she carried it anyway, not for recognition, not for reward. But because some people are simply built that way, wired for devotion in a world that does not always deserve it. If this story found you today, I do not think that was an accident. Maybe you needed to hear about a woman who kept going when no one was watching. You may need the reminder that quiet strength is still strength. That unseen sacrifice still counts. Your worth is not determined by the people who failed to see it. If it moved you, if there was a moment that made you sit up a little straighter or feel something you needed to feel, leave me a comment below. Tell me which part stayed with you. I read every single one, and you have no idea how much each word means to me. Subscribe to this channel and turn on your notifications so you never miss a story. I am always in here, writing the next one, with you in mind, for you specifically, because you are exactly the kind of person these stories are made for. I will see you in the next one.